But before we jump into the topic for today, okay, let me do a quick introduction for those who might not be very familiar with NUS ISS. Okay, so NUS ISS, our main vision, okay, is basically to enable a digital economy that is always learning and always leading, especially in times like this where every one of us is actually stranded at home, okay, doing e-learning, doing e-work. Okay, it's even more important for us to be able to help the society on building a digital economy. And we do that by developing the digital talents through our education program, our applied research consultancy, and of course our career services. So for some, you might think that NUS ISS is just doing training, but actually we do a lot more than training. We also do research consultancy, and we also help with the career services as well. Okay, and for our education program, okay, we have both the graduate program and also the executive education program. That's on top of our e-government leadership program and also our smart health leadership program as well. And you can find out more about all the different kind of programs and the different training courses that's available, okay, in our website www.iss.nus.edu.sg. Okay, and for today's Zoom session, just a few requests. First and foremost, if those are you're using your laptop to view this webinar, do switch off your mobile phone, put it to silence or do it vibrate mode, and also to mute your microphone to avoid disrupting the speaking during the session. Okay, and if you do have any question at any point in time during the webinar, do type in your question in the Zoom chat function. We'll be monitoring the Zoom chat function, and at the later part of our webinar, we'll try to answer as many questions as you have. Okay, and last but not least, we also do hope that you'll be able to help us do an e-feedback at the end of the webinar. We'll be sharing you a QR code. Okay, and once complete upon completion of the feedback form, okay, we'll also be sharing with you the slides that have been used by the speakers today. So don't worry that I will be flashing this QR code again at the end of the session, so there's no need to take out your phone right now and rush to get this QR code scan. Okay, so in today's webinar, we'll be touching on topics related to both the DevOps and site reliability engineering, also known as the SRE. Okay, we all probably are following the news very closely during this circuit breaker period. And just a couple of days ago, I can't remember, perhaps Monday or Tuesday, you'll probably recall the news regarding NTUC site being temporarily taken down due to the high volume of traffic for the self-employed trying to access the site to apply for the income relief scheme, because the scheme actually give out a total of $9,000 over in 3 different payments. Okay, and when the site was down, these self-employed start to worry, because they are worried that if they can't access the site, they can't apply, and they won't be able to get that $9,000 payout, which is quite substantial during this period. And it's actually very interesting to know how SRE, or site reliability engineering, can actually be adopted to prepare for such high transaction, high volume system launch, and thus avoiding the unnecessary anxiety. In addition, there's also sometimes confusion between what is SRE or what is DevOps, because if you Google, sometimes it might not have give you a very clear understanding. So in today's session, we'll also be sharing more on both what is SRE and DevOps, as ISS actually offer both training courses as well in SRE and DevOps. And for today's webinar, we have very good speaker lineup. We have first and foremost have Jamie, the co-founder from VisionLed. He'll be telling us more on the difference between DevOps and SRE. And then we have Sriram Subramanian from the Standard Chart, the head of SRE for the transaction and global banking technology. He'll be talking more on SRE as well. Okay, and then followed, we will have Yen, head of platform and SRE for HOOQ. Okay, Yen will be sharing with us on how to use infrastructure as code in the new paradigm shift. And to end off the webinar, we have Mr. Krist Yong, General Manager from EnablePS. And Krist will be sharing with us on how to build a digital operating model for high velocity IT. And I'm sure everyone is looking forward to the exciting topic that's coming up. So without further ado, I shall pass it over to the first speaker to kick off the webinar. So just bear with me while we'll get Jamie to take over and to do the sharing. Okay, seems like Jamie might not be here yet. So will Mr. Sriram, will you be able to start off the session first to talk about your SRE? Is it the bike or the sidecar first?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, let me end my sharing then. Oh. Okay, you can take over the sharing anytime.
Okay, let me just bring up my presentation. Give me a minute. Okay. Okay, are you guys able to see my screen? Can the coaches confirm?
Yes, Sriram, we can see your screen.
Okay, I'm just gonna do make sure I'm able to move across the slides. Give me 1 minute. Yes, I'm able to. Okay. Thank you, NUSIS, for having me here today. We are in very, very strange times. I was looking forward to doing this session in person, but unfortunately, COVID has obviously played foul, and here we are learning new ways of working. Before I start, right, I would want to just give a brief introduction about myself so that there is some context set around why I'm here and what is it that I'm going to share in the next 25 minutes or so. So I've been in technology for the last 23 odd years, working largely with financial institutions. And I've been in Singapore for 16 years, and before that I've been in different parts of the world. I've done build, run, change, and at this point of time I head SRE SRE for transaction and global banking technology within Standard Chartered. Now, I'm also one of the leading evangelists for SRE in the bank, simply because it's new to us. Okay. In the next 25 minutes, whatever I tell is my personal view. It's got nothing to do with the bank. I just want to give it a caveat and a disclaimer. These are my personal views because I'm very passionate about SRE. Okay. In the next 25 minutes, I will cover some history because I'm drawing analogy from World War II. Because every time humanity has faced adversity, we tend to learn more and we come out stronger. And I thought there was some real good analogy that I could draw from World War II. And I'll start from there and set the scene, and then I'll get into SRE. Okay, so World War II, there are two events which people say World War II, because of which World War II got triggered. One was in 1937 when there was a conflict between Japan and China. And the other one in 1939 when Germany invaded Poland and they drew in France and Britain into war. Now, this, World War II, it's very strange that, in these times, in COVID times, when we have, over 3 million people infected, it's an irony that I'm drawing analogy from World War II, but I think still it was the bloodiest time that humanity has ever faced. We were losing almost 27,000 people every year, every day for nearly 6 years. And I don't think we should be ever there. But again, this time it's nature's wrath. So hopefully we'll get over it. Okay, so during the war, Germany knew that it was going to be a very long war, and they needed a very light combat vehicle which could be deployed at will in the front lines. It could move assets. And this is where our story starts. Okay. So a bit of history around the main theme, which is the BMW R75 bike. Now, I'm sure there are some bike enthusiasts here, or people who have done engineering. Probably they'll relate to it more. And or if you're a World War II or a history fan, you probably will draw some analogy or some other analogy as well, besides what I'm telling. Okay. Now, bikes with sidecars were always present even before this war. But what made BMW R75 a very special vehicle from which I draw analogy? As I said, Germany needed a very light vehicle, which acts as also something which the gunners could use for combat. They wanted to use it for messengers. They wanted to use it for swarming enemy areas. They wanted to have capability to form small squads to contain impact radius, and they wanted a vehicle which could adapt to any terrain. And it's quite interesting because when you look at the history of BMW and this vehicle in particular, this was built post another vehicle that was built for the same purpose, which is called the Zundap KS750. But obviously BMW became prominent post-war, and this model then started influencing many other bikes for a very, very long time. And I'll delve into why the salient features of this bike and how it was used is so relevant to an analogy that we can draw as we construct an SRE organization. Moving on to the next slide. Now, the BMW R75, as I said, was very nimble, and typically Germany would have, a bunch of 10 or 12 of these bikes, which each bike having 3 riders, go collectively as one squad, typically. But there have been times when even these bikes would go independently into hostile territory or to front lines or as messengers. Now, the unique function of this bike was laid down by the roles that the people who were on these bikes played, right? The driver was very clear that he had a roadmap to go, he had a direction towards. The gunner was there to remove impediments, and the observer, the man who was sitting behind, his role was to trace the route, to tell and guide the driver as to where we are going. And together they formed a great combination because any of them could play any of those roles in the R75. Okay, and the uniqueness of this bike when compared to the other sidecars was the R75, and those who know engineering would probably relate to it easy, and those who have done NS for sure. Unlike the other bikes in those days, the engine was not driving a chain. It had a shaft, and that was then connected to the axle for the third wheel. So it was actually one unit, and the sidecar was permanently fixed. So as a unit, you can really differentiate who was, from a role perspective, anybody could do any role. So you can really differentiate the unit one from the other. So they were collectively a punch above their weight because they would also accompany, trucks of troops and also tanks. And they probably were sometimes harbinger to towns before the army advanced. So, and they were extremely maneuverable, right? So that's the analogy I'm setting so that when we go into SRE, you draw some of this. I'll draw some of these strengths of the R75 and how we can influence, SRE can influence the organization. Moving on. Sorry. Yes. Yeah. Okay. Now, before I start on this slide, and I know Jamie was supposed to cover DevOps and SRE. It's a very loosely coined term, DevOps and SRE, and everybody's got a different definition. I completely understand that, and I respect that as well. I'll give you my experience of SRE in the context of AR75 and also in context of what we are doing within the bank and how we are shaping the organization to basically change some of the way we do things, and that's a part of the experience. But I've applied these principles in other firms before Standard Chartered as well. Okay, now typically, if you look at, if anybody's reading the SRE book from Google, they will talk about SRE and features team. If you talk about blogs from Bloomberg, NAB, they talk about features and non-features. So typically an SRE and features both can only coexist when we have a very clear platform and the roles have been very clearly defined. a lot of organizations fail to get to the zenith of this model because there is no clear agreement of the roles and responsibility of an SRE and features team. So what do we draw when we look at R75? R75, there were roles, but it's not dependent on people. So if you look at R75, anybody could be the gunner, anybody could be the driver, anybody could be the observer. Same here. You could have an organization where if you had the right skills, you should be able to move, or an organization should be able to move people across between SRE and features. Second, SREs remove obstacles on the current platform as feature developers build product roadmaps. This again comes back to the analogy of R75, where the gunner is removing impediments, whereas the driver is actually marching forward. And why I say this is, it might not be true for fintechs or product companies, but when you look at financial institutions where I come from, we deal with large architectures of really complex systems. And these systems are also layered in their age. Some of them are really old, some of them are now and current, some of them are basically, we are building to future-proof ourselves. So as we go on this journey, right, it is very important that the old, which allows us to protect the revenue or hold the fort, or keep the lights on, is not forgotten. Because in a typical model, what would happen is the support organization would be dealing with the leftover of what's in production, and there's very little investment on the old platforms, or platforms which are current but not really new. And most of the investment will go into the newer platforms where there is investment and where the latest technology is being applied. But from a functionality perspective, the older platforms continue to generate revenue. They continue to be the backbone of the organization. And I'm sure many of you in this forum would agree to this view, that there's a lot of legacy platforms and a lot of older platforms which continue to become pillars of the organization till the time the new platforms come in. And there's little or very minimal investment done on that. And the expectation is that support would basically be dealing with everything very manually. And again, the analogy is, if SRE was there and if you had a proper SRE organization, the SRE organization would bring significant efficiency to your older stack of applications, while the features team can build new products or new features on the forward-looking platforms. The third part is, if you look at the R75, you had a role of an observer, and his role was very clear: look forward, look who's behind, looks on the side, look at the map, trace the road, tell the driver. So that was his role. So if you look at SRE, and if you look at where we are now, gone are the days where we talked about monitoring, right? Monitoring is a very, very small word. And again, it's very loosely coined with observability. Observability and monitoring are not the same thing. Observability is a significantly different, is a very different beast altogether, because observability now, in the current terms with digitization, it's about having information of everything that's happening in the platform and across a service. That means you're having near real-time data of what's happening on every single transaction as the status of the transaction changes. So that encompasses monitoring, log aggregation, ML, analytics, all of that. So all of that together is observability. And to build a great observability platform, you will never be able to achieve this, or an organization typically fail to achieve this, when you have features team trying to do it and support trying to just fight the fires. So that's where SRE comes in, and SREs should be able to build that capability, which allows organizations to move forward and build significant observability on the legacy and the current platforms. But those then become blueprints for future platforms that are going to be built, which includes standards of instrumentation, blueprint for how clusters will be there, etc., etc. Coming back to the next point, which is around the larger part of SRE is, and if you look at Google books, they keep talking about SRE should be industrializing or automating everything that's possible. And in the legacy model, where you have a support organization and a development organization, the support organization is dealing with manual tasks day in, day out to keep the platforms running. They're basically acting like bandages, and they do the same thing again and again without fail. And when they fail, obviously they're not in the best books, right? SRE can change all of that, because you can move away from very inefficient processes to processes which can be industrialized, and systems can self-heal, or there are tools for first responding squads to recover from incidents. And this again comes back to the point of when you look at analogy with R75, the fact that there were squads, they would be able to swarm onto hot zones, dose the fire, and move out. This is exactly the capability that SRE is bringing. Last but not the least, if you look at analogy, is about R75 was used to deploy assets in the front line, send messages to the front line, come back very quick. Harbinger to the bigger artilleries coming into towns or villages or enemy territory. So SREs can build that capability like R75 around auto deployment, auto build, right? So the whole build, integration, and deploy can be done by SRE, and that's largely what the definition of DevOps at this point of time is. How do we basically bring speed to the pipeline, and how fast can we deliver code to production? So that's another aspect which we can draw analogy from R75, and I think it's a fantastic it's a fantastic capability, because if SRE is influenced by so many things and it can bring all of this to the table, you actually come and outline a very clear role definition between what a reliability engineer should do to what a features developer should do. Okay. Moving on. Sorry. Okay. So I go back to the name, right? So Google called it site reliability engineering way back in 2003. Because Google has a site. It made absolute sense for them to bring a framework which they have applied to a site. And to the earlier words my co-speaker had was around how the recent claim site went down because of it was overwhelmed, and that's a site. But if you look at it in current terms, and if you look at it intrinsically from an organization and not from an external point of view, you're talking about systems who basically should be built reliably, should have inbuilt reliability, or systems that should be managed with reliability. So I can argue it need not be site reliability engineering, but it could translate to systems reliability engineering. But then when you look at services, like you're talking about digitization, and it's moving, everything is moving to API and API calls, whether be it we booking a cab, we basically doing some transaction with the bank, everything is basically API calls. So you can argue saying, if you look at end to end from a client journey perspective, it's a service. So why not call it service reliability engineering? But does it really matter? It doesn't matter. Actually, what we should take away from Google is actually the framework that it brings in. And the framework that it aims to bring is, how do we get full stack developers? Full stack engineers, because there's a big difference between developers and engineers. When I say full stack engineers, how do we get full stack engineers to bring some common sense around the reliability and automation of services before technical debt consumes the organization? Because typically, as I said, you would have the split in the organization between support and development. Development keep building new features, but there's so much of technical debt, and one fine day the systems start failing over, you have a bout of serious incidents, and then the whole organization stops everything and starts to fix the problem. But then they are in a chicken egg situation, because they want to march ahead with the new platform where there's investment done, but at the same time the older platform might have been so old where you may not even be able to get some of the vendor code, or even the code probably is not available, it's just binaries that are available. So I think in order to get to understand the older code and to continuously maintain the code line along with making it reliable, I think we need very strong full stack engineers. And that means That means technical people who understand not only the code, but they understand network, storage, databases, web services, how ESX boxes work, right? How switches work, because ultimately good SREs are extremely good. They have a very broad brush around technology, and they understand this very well, right? So SRE should be able to secure the foundation before organization is in a haste to build features. The next point is, every organization has different models of execution. And I was in a conference last year at Dublin on SRE Con. And we had a lot of great presenters come in and talk about how SRE is changing their world, their life, and how it's made a big difference to the organization. But in a lot of cases, we saw SRE getting restricted from a definition perspective of what Google wanted to do. And a lot of people kept discussing around observability largely, or speed to the VX or the pipeline that gets code into production, right? But is it what SRE is? Is that how organizations should have SREs? And this is a question that we can take during a Q&A session, and I would want to definitely hear from my co-speakers as well, coaches as well, right? But some of the misleading patterns in the industry, and it's probably one of the points is controversial to Jimmy's session as well, is one, DevOps and SRE are misnomers, and sometimes they're coined quite loosely and they seem to be interchangeable, but is it really interchangeable? Okay. Two, I have seen models written in public forums and in blogs and technical blogs, where there are organizations who have made mistakes of renaming support into SRE. Okay. But in the true sense, and if you read the whole framework of SRE, and if you look at the definitions of SRE, because the SRE framework defined by Google is being termed as the Bible at this point in time, it's much broader, right? And I can tell you that on the sides I have put some of the enablers that SRE brings. It's not limited to this set, but some of things I did want to cover as what SREs could do and how they could play a role in the organization, right? So CI/CD, which is pretty much what DevOps does, technical functional tracing, which is more around observability and how you build observability platforms, whether it's more from a technical perspective where you want to have tracing across microservice and distributed tracing, or you want to have functional tracing as to how the status of a transaction changes across the whole service journey. That's another piece. Automated DR, what kind of clustering you want to have, what's the blueprint that we want for automated DR failovers, what's the RTO, RPO, etc. I mean, SRE can influence all of that. Blue-green releases, canary releases, the whole blue-green infrastructure and the canary releases, log aggregation, ML, which is again part of observability, monitoring obviously is part of observability, software scaling and code optimization, right? There is a lot of current code where there is more investment in features, but there's technical debt, there's inefficiencies, things like threading. What's the right threading for a particular piece of component? The code might have been written 4 years back, 4 threads were enough, but now it could scale. And also we could basically have more services, more processes running in pods for the same code. So should the threading be at 3 as it was, or should it go to 10? So all that can be done because it's non-functional work. So it's not features, it's about the technical capability of the platform. So those are things which SRE could look at. Again, automating manual tasks, right? A lot of things that support do today in any organization is largely very manual. Is it something where SRE can make a difference? And in the DevOps terms, if you look at from a DevOps, in a lot of DevOps definitions, you would have very little of this from a scope perspective. But from an SRE perspective, when you look at Google's book, this is all pretty much in scope, right? Regression testing, right? Because a lot of problems you see for future code coming into production is from the past, is from what you see in test. The more and more SRE starts controlling what's going into test, and they look at the outcomes coming out of test for each cycle, the support teams should be more confident of what's getting into production. And the question then becomes, as you mature, do you really need a support organization? Because if you can build confidence on regression with automation, and you have sight to the problems that you can anticipate in production. That means you already have full stack engineers looking at to the left of your SDLC lifecycle. So they already have sight to what's coming into production, and they should be in a much better position to support it. Should it have a problem in production in a day 0 to day 30, and typically in most organizations that would be some kind of a warranty with the features team, right? So together they should be able to manage that. So regression is another piece that SRE could own. And last but not the least, the cloud enablement, right? The Terraform and Cloud Foundry, how you build scripts to spin-off environments, right, for lower, is something which SRE could do. Again, this is not an exhaustive list, but I think these are all things which SRE can play a role in, and the scope's quite large. Okay. Moving on to the next slide. Challenges, and this is where a lot of you who are on this call might have experienced these challenges. These are challenges that I have seen day in, day out, I think, and we are working through them. Okay. So SRE transformation, and this is a very, very common, some of the statements I make here are very, very common. Even when I went to Dublin on the SRE Con, they were absolutely same. A lot of organizations, a lot of speakers came and said, we need sponsorship top down. There has to be a very clear mandate that there is going to be an SRE function, and there's going to be a features team, and there is a career path. If that's there, then you basically get into the win-win situation of forming an SRE team. 2, SRE is a mindset change. It's not going to happen today. So let's say there's an organization, they change their support team and they rename it SRE. It's not going to work because you need full stack engineers. So SRE is a mindset change. You need the right people, but you also need to constantly change and tell people what SRE is about, because a lot of times developers don't understand, feature team developers don't understand what SRE is, support teams don't understand what SRE is, but there's going to be a small group of people who are going to be constantly evangelizing this, right? So SRE is a complete mindset change, and it needs prolonged cycles of iterative communication, hackathons, training, so that you build the organization with an engineering culture. The best SREs I've seen are people typically who come from support, but they have a very strong technical mind, and they develop themselves into full stack engineers, right? Because they understand the nuances of production, which is very different to how features team do development, unit testing, do some integration, give it off to test, to do regression and move on. Again, this might not be true with small fintechs and product companies because it's one monolithic platform of probably a couple of products, but it's very true for large organizations, financials or not. This would be a very similar problem. So you would have people from support who are very technical, who understand those platforms very well, but if they then develop engineering capabilities, then they become extremely important for the organization because they are able to bring efficiency. At the same time, they can bring speed to feature releases, and then feature teams can actually do what they're supposed to do, which is make value in the product so that there's more revenue for the firm. Lastly, because of the way I've defined SRE and how I feel SRE should be structured, SREs should contribute to blueprints for instrumentation, resiliency design, so that as a firm, we don't have any Groundhog Day. Okay, next one, a quick recap. SRE is a mindset change and needs sponsorship. Transformation into an SRE function takes time, and this is tried and tested, and this is absolutely the proof in the pudding is from the fact that after almost 17 years, still Google writes about SRE. You still have organizations who have just started their SRE journey, and also we have spoken to organizations where they have taken 3 years and it's taking them even more time to transform. So this is absolutely a fact. SRE function has a significant scope to improve productivity besides reliability, scalability, operability, and observability, all those tenets. They've got significant scope to improve productivity. SRE, if defined right, will speed up product roadmap and improve resiliency. SREs are most effective when they bring in SME knowledge of systems along with full stack engineering capabilities. And last but not the least, SRE is a catalyst to design strategic services. And why I say this is because if they are learning from existing platforms and legacy platforms and current platforms, they are improving those platforms for resiliency, reliability, observability. There's a lot to learn from those to create the blueprints that influence the strategic platforms. So that's my session, and I would encourage all of you to think about SRE in a much broader perspective. Jamie, I'm sorry, I don't know whether I did justice to your session, but this is a view that I have. That's all I had to say. I'm happy to give it to Jamie if he's the next speaker.
Thank you very much, Sri. Much appreciated.
Okay, let me just disconnect myself. Give me a minute. Stop share. Over to you. Yeah, over to you.
Okay, so let me share my screen and let's see, share. Okay, are you able to see okay?
Yes, Jamie, we can see your screen.
Okay, let me just go full screen. And everything's still okay, loud and clear?
Yes.
Very good. Thank you very much. And apologies to everyone who's dialed in. As a result of this quarantine, I've got my days muddled up. I had honestly thought we were running this session tomorrow, but apparently not. That's a public holiday. So excuse my tardiness. For those that haven't seen me before, met me before, my name is Jamie Donoghue. So I'm a partner of ISS, and I deliver a number of different training courses, including DevOps and BizOps, and our upcoming course, which is aptly titled Site Reliability Engineering. So for my course, my section, I want to go through 3 topics. First one is, what is DevOps? We'll quickly go through this one, because I would hope that we all know what is DevOps by now, but just to be sure, I'll give a brief introduction to SRE, Site Reliability Engineering, and then talk about some of the differences at the end. So for the first topic, what is DevOps? We're going to do this a little bit different. Rather than me having slides, we're going to play a little game. Now, I do play this game in my DevOps Foundation course. So if you have been a student of mine at ISS, you should hopefully get all of these answers correct. But let's see. So it's a simple game. There are 10 statements. For each statement, you need to indicate whether you believe that statement is true or false. Now, I can't see you, of course, being through Zoom. So I will just have to assume that you are being honest with your answers. But so there'll be 10 statements. Each statement, do you think it is true or false? So first is, DevOps is a role. Okay. So is DevOps a role? No, it is false. I'll come back to the answers at the end of the statements, but first, DevOps itself is not a role. Second, DevOps focuses upon the 3 ways. If you don't know what the 3 ways are, then you definitely need to come to the DevOps Foundation course. We will teach you these. So this one is true. DevOps means dev doing ops, sometimes referred to as no ops. This is false. Statement number 4, DevOps does not need CEO support. So quite high level here. We're talking beyond our CIO. Okay, that is false. DevOps does need CEO support. We'll talk about that. DevOps is a cultural movement. Okay, first and foremost, yes, DevOps is a cultural movement. That is true. Statement number 6, DevOps has an owner. Like PMP, Project Management Professional, owned by the Project Management Institute, Prince2, owned by Axelos, ITIL, owned by Axelos, COBIT, owned by ISACA, etc. DevOps has an owner. That is false, no owner for DevOps. Statement number 7, DevOps has a body of knowledge. You can download or buy the official book of DevOps. I can see answers in our chat windows. This one is false. There is no official body of knowledge for DevOps. Statement number 8, DevOps replaces service management. And the other acronym there, ITIL, which is the framework which is usually synonymous with service management. So does DevOps replace service management? No, it does not. 2 more, statement number 9, DevOps requires experimentation. Okay, this one is true. It's one of the 3 ways of DevOps. Experimentation is the 3rd way. And the last statement, statement number 10, DevOps requires automation. All right, we have some people having a go. This one is false, and maybe a bit irritating for me to explain why. So here are all the answers. You will get the slide deck after the session. So DevOps is a role that is false. There is a role called DevOps engineer, which is very common, but DevOps is a cultural movement to get dev and ops to work together. DevOps focuses on the 3 ways. That's true. These are the 3 basic principles of DevOps, that we optimize flow, we practice quick and frequent feedback, and the 3rd way of experimentation. DevOps means dev doing ops? Not at all. It's a cultural movement of getting dev and ops to collaborate to improve flow. DevOps doesn't need CEO support. Interesting statement, and it's false. You do need CEO support. Now, why is that? Well, DevOps and site reliability engineering and Agile are ways for IT to practice high velocity. So high velocity IT, which is a strategy. It is an alternative strategy to IT is a low cost cost center. So if you are going to change the strategy of IT, it needs to be in support of a wider business strategy. So high velocity business needs high velocity IT. So we can't go changing IT strategy without being in alignment with the business. So that's why number 4 is false. DevOps is first and foremost about people. So it is a cultural movement. There is no owner. So it's very much like Agile as a movement. Because it has no owner, there is no one that can claim an official body of knowledge. But there are lots of books that practitioners will read, a lot of similar books. DevOps does not replace service management. In fact, DevOps and service management go hand in hand. Of course, low cost service management is not appropriate, but high velocity service management makes sense with DevOps. DevOps requires experimentation. That's the 3rd way of DevOps. And DevOps requires automation. Not true. DevOps is first and foremost about people. So it doesn't require automation. However, it would definitely benefit from automation. So number 10, very, very sneaky statement, very hard to get right, but you can still practice the culture of DevOps without going and buying a new suite of tools. So DevOps, there is that cultural philosophy. It doesn't have an official body of knowledge, but a lot of people start by reading the Phoenix Project. This is where we get introduced to the 3 ways. And those 3 ways are flow, feedback, and experimentation. Now, you can read more about that in the Phoenix Project book. You can, of course, come to our DevOps Foundations course, and we would teach you the basic principles. There are also 5 values of DevOps called CALMs: culture, automation, lean, measurement, and sharing. And of those 5 values, if I asked you which value do you think that DevOps practitioners or DevOps organizations typically emphasize more than anything else, it does seem to be hire a DevOps engineer and set up a tool chain. Yes, you can definitely progress towards high velocity IT with automation, but you're not dealing with the fundamental problems of having different cultures within IT. For example, if you have slow development and slow operations, then you will have slow deployment, and that's not a problem. This is the old-fashioned SDLC model. If you change part of your culture, and so you practice agile development, but operations is still doing, centralized change management and its lengthy release processes, then we are still slow with putting things into production. So only when we address the whole culture of development and operations, and we call that together DevOps, do we actually get high velocity IT. So that was a quick summary on DevOps. This is not a DevOps seminar, this is SRE seminar, but just wanted to see if you were all comfortable with some of those, the basics. Now, into what is SRE? So site reliability engineering started before DevOps existed. It was basically Google's approach to DevOps before DevOps was even a thing. And in the book, they talk about how this SRE practice was actually what was a competitive advantage for Google. So they never shared it with anybody, and because you don't share your competitive advantage. However, once DevOps came out, then Google realized that the world had caught up, and it actually made sense for them to share, because if Google's customers know these practices, then it solves a lot of the pain points that we have when Google is working on projects with its customers. So there's a very interesting book there called Site Reliability Engineering. Sri had that in his presentation as well. It is a free book, so if you search for that online, you'll be able to find the HTML version of it. Quite an interesting read, being that it comes from Google engineers. It does start at 20,000 feet and then all of a sudden drop to 2 feet, which can be a bit of a shock, but definitely interesting nonetheless. Now, what do SREs do? Well, SREs do many things. I have called out just a few that I want to talk about today. The first one is that SREs are engineers. In Google, they were called site reliability engineers, but you could call them, as Sri mentioned, service reliability engineers or system reliability engineers. That's perfectly fine. But they are engineers that share accountability for service levels. So whether we call it product service level, application service level, but it is shared accountability. Second, they champion engineering practices. We have traditional engineering practices, which I'll show you in a moment, as well as some newer practices. And they also automate operations. So automating operations to improve service levels, which could be resilience, performance, but also to reduce toil. Now, toil is a Google term. It's used for all of the manual side of IT. So we want to reduce as much of the manual IT operations work as possible. The lady on the left is not an SRE. She is a superhero, and she is not what we want in IT. Superheroes, as good as they are, do not scale very well. So what we want are the items on the right, but we don't want the superheroes on the left. So for the first one, shared accountability, there is a great website where you can have a look at a few different organization models for DevOps, and one of those models is Google's SRE model. So Google's model is quite unique. It wouldn't suit a lot of companies, but the way they work is that SRE is a team that straddles operations and development. And so they basically take the responsibility for running an application from the development team so that that development team can then work on other new projects. So the SRE actually takes over. However, it isn't a letting go. So they're still working very closely together, the SRE is just maintaining the day-to-day running of that service or that application. And what is fundamental to a Google SRE is that they are a developer. So an SRE is first and foremost a developer. They are not the traditional system administrator that has been promoted into that role. So they are a developer, they can speak to developers, they understand code, and they try to practice their programming, scripting capability into operations to really reduce some of that manual overhead. So an SRE could deal with a minor software change without having to send it back to the development team. So the team that's running it day to day, which is the SRE team, can do the minor changes, as well as looking after the operations side, the incidents and the problems. This particular model is useful when you have a very large team. Of course, Google is very large. Their developers are the best in the world, and they don't want to tie up their developers with really lower level work like minor bug fixes, minor interface changes, and certainly not infrastructure issues. So the SRE team takes some of that burden away from the dev team so that they can focus upon development. This particular model, though, is not suitable for all organizations. An alternative which I found was a company called Acquia. It's a digital product team. And so rather than having an SRE team, they actually put an SRE within the product team. So whether you call it a Scrum team, a microservices team, a product team, one of the roles that they have in Acquia within all of their product teams is a site reliability engineer. So someone who can handle infrastructure issues, someone who can also converse with the developers and can manage the bridge in between. So Google's particular model works for Google. They're very large and they have massive services. Acquia, as a smaller organization, has said, well, we like the role of SRE. We think what they do is very good, but we don't have the size or the scale to have dedicated teams. And so we will just embed the capability within the product team instead. For number 2, champion engineering practices. Well, there's typical engineering practices that we might get taught in university or in polytechnic, such as software engineering, sysadmin, systems engineering, and network engineering. So these engineering practices are very important, and SRE would have to have some capability here. And then we have the more modern practices, such as the advanced release engineering practices, which a lot of people refer to as CI/CD, which is typically what we associate with a DevOps engineer, someone who can implement a release tool chain and can implement various release practices such as canarying, blue-green releasing, etc. Performance engineering is a variation on what ITIL would have taught us. So ITIL would have taught us about service level agreements. Google takes it a little bit further. They have service level objectives, which we can think about as really a tighter SLA. So these are internal measurements within IT. We aim for the SLOs, and as long as we can meet the SLOs definitely can be achieved. Using error budgets is an alternative way to look at managing a release cadence. So how quickly can we release? It all depends on how much error budget we have remaining for the month. And managing on call. So ITIL would teach us about escalation of tickets, so level 1 to level 2 to level 3. That's low cost model. That's all about reducing the cost of incident tickets. Whereas more modern approach, which is swarming enabled through chat ops, would really help us to resolve incidents much faster, where cost is not such an issue. It's really emphasizing speed or high velocity is our goal. Other practices may be chaos engineering, which is an evolution from disaster recovery testing. So with DR testing, we kind of wait till a disaster happens, and then we hope to God that our plans work. Whereas with chaos engineering, we're actively trying to break our systems and learn from them. And let's break our production systems and learn from them so that we can increase our resilience without having to wait for a real disaster to occur. And then practices as well about reducing toil, manual IT work through automation. So really talking about, writing SOPs, or as modern term for SOP might be runbook. We would usually, in a traditional model, we would usually just document the SOP. In high velocity IT, the SRE would really want to try to automate as much of the SOP as possible, using Rundesk or any number of scripting tools. Also practices to increase self-service. So that could be through chatbots, or it could be through something like a ServiceNow process orchestration. But again, reducing the manual burden upon IT. A lot of practices potentially for an SRE, which goes to show that this might not be somebody's first role. It might be coming later on in their career when they have a bit more experience. Reducing toil is the manual characteristics there on the right-hand side. So any manual work, repetitive, low value. And the last thing is that it scales in a linear fashion with growth. So in the Google context, they have a policy which states that an SRE can only spend a maximum of X amount of time on manual work, and the rest of their time should be spent on trying to automate all of this manual work. The reason that they're quite specific with setting times, whether it's 50-50 or 60-40, is because if you don't allocate the time, then it just doesn't happen. We get stuck in firefighting mode for the rest of our lives. Now, how does Google deal with, there's lots of fires, but the SRE is supposed to be working on their projects? Well, if this occurs, then they actually push back the fires to the development team. So this is why in Google, the development team and the SRE, it's not a permanent handover where we just let go forever. It is a hand-holding, and SRE will deal with all of the fires up until a certain time limit has been spent, a certain amount of utilization has been spent, and beyond that, the development team will have to take over and start doing some of the lower level work that they really wouldn't enjoy. But is necessary if we're going to bring in some of the automation projects. Now that linear scaling problem, just to show you, if we look at a very simple ratio there in the kind of the orange peachy colored column there, IT staff 1 to 100. So looking at a very simple ratio for every user, 100 users, you have 1 IT staff. You have 10,000 IT users, we have 100 staff. Doesn't seem so bad. But as soon as we get to very high numbers, 10 million users, we need 100,000 staff. It doesn't look realistic. And it's actually 100,000 staff would be 3 times the size of Monaco. So that's quite a large IT department for an organization that accepts manual work. If we can take an SRE approach, and so we dedicate the time to reduce the toil, we can break that linear pattern. And so we can see a very clear difference in the number of IT people we need with and without SRE. Now in the green column, this is just indicative numbers, but there are lots of organizations, web-based organizations, new startups that have many millions of users and a very, very limited number of staff in comparison to a traditional organization. So reducing toil, yes, helps with application performance, but it also helps to solve that linear scaling issue that we have in IT if we just accept that manual work comes with the job. So SREs need to balance their time. They do need to do firefighting, of course, but they also need to do their engineering projects. Whether it's 50-50 or 60-40, it depends. But if it is not explicitly stated, that blue box, it's not going to happen. And you know that. You're just going to be stuck dealing with problems, and you will get to the projects when you have time, i.e. never. So SREs won't work without the ability to stop releasing when that error budget has been exhausted, which means that we have broken the service as much as is allowed for this month. We have to stop now and work on reliability. We have the ability to pass on additional firefighting effort back to the development team when we exceed our, our target utilization with firefighting. And that policy must be endorsed by, someone quite senior within IT, because if it isn't endorsed at that level, it isn't going to happen. So that was a very short overview of SRE. There'll be more in the upcoming course, first run, I think, in June. You can look out for that. So looking for DevOps versus SRE versus ITSM, DevOps has many configurations. So all of these topologies, ways in which dev can work with ops, is DevOps. And SRE is a very specific way, or a way, one way, not the way, but one way to practice the culture of DevOps. So this little bit of code comes from some very interesting videos that Google had published on SRE versus DevOps. And they have an SRE practitioner and a DevOps practitioner in those videos, and they came up with this class SRE implements DevOps. So we're basically saying that SRE is to DevOps as what Scrum is to Agile. So DevOps as an umbrella, Agile as an umbrella, and then SRE is a very specific way to practice. We must not forget IT service management. IT service management has a huge repository. It has official publications of lots of different practices. The ones that I've highlighted can be tailored to enable high velocity IT. ITIL 4 actually has a book called High Velocity IT. So they're identifying how, these practices can be modified from being low cost practices, which you may have implemented change management as a low cost practice, but how you can now tailor that to become a practice that enables high velocity IT instead. So don't forget our existing repositories of good practices. So in summary, SRE is one way to practice the culture of DevOps. SRE shares the same principles and values, so the 3 ways and the CALMs are equally shared. SRE uses a mix of traditional engineering practices like software engineering, system engineering, and modern engineering practices like high velocity release engineering, chaos engineering, etc. SREs must balance their time across reactive and proactive work. Otherwise, the proactive work will not happen. So if the proactive work does happen, then SREs can solve the scaling problem with traditional ops, and we won't have issues where we cannot scale rapidly because the business is growing rapidly because we just can't cope with rapid change. And last is that DevOps and SRE practitioners do have an extensive repository out there from service management, but you must be cautious that when we do adopt any good practice or best practice, that we want to make sure that we are tailoring it for the goal of high velocity IT. Okay, that's my end. Now, Aaron, I think we're going to do Q&A. We'll save that until the Q&A panel.
Yep, correct.
Yeah. Okay, good. All right, thank you very much. So I will release. You are sharing, stop share.
Okay, thanks, Jamie. Okay, I think we'd like to invite our next speaker, Yen, to talk about the infrastructure as code. Yen, over to you.
Yep. Hello, everybody. Give me a second. I will try to share my screen. Just let me know if you can see it.
Yes, Yen, we can see your screen.
Okay. Okay. Probably first, thank you very much for ISS to organizing this event, this webinar, and to Jamie for invitation and for the speakers. I will focus mostly on DevOps or SRE from trenches, more on the practical perspective and how we solve specific problems. And before I can start, let me build some credibility in the audience. So I mostly have an academia background. I spent almost 30 years in university, so 5 years as university lecturer in Europe. Overall, I have like 20 plus years experience in technology. 13 years I spent in the financial services in the banks. So quite passionate for agile, lean, DevOps, SRE, cloud, and data engineering side. Probably my first agile project was in 2006, so it's quite a while. But my full understanding was probably around like 2010. Currently in HOOQ, I'm leading the cloud engineering team, SRE, and data engineering side. I have few certification, mostly in the technology space, like GCP, AWS, plus Agile. A little bit on the HOOQ. So what is HOOQ? And probably some quick disclaimers. So unfortunately, the HOOQ went into liquidation this month, actually, during the business changes. But everything what I'm present here is still completely valid and mostly from experience. Yeah. So the HOOQ was founded in 2015. So the main product was the video streaming, so as OTT provider. So the parent company who initiated the HOOQ was like a Sony Pictures, Warner Brother, and Singtel. This is our biggest shareholders. And we've been focusing mostly on the markets where the Singtel have a big presence, like Singapore, Philippines, Thailand, India, and Indonesia. As competitors, Netflix, iFlix, Hulu, Amazon Prime Video, Disney Plus. Probably one of the reasons I joined the company is just knowing that I will compete with the Netflix, which is these guys are one of the best in the industry in technologies. We have a lot of partners. So the HOOQ is not only B2C business. We also have a huge B2B presence with a partner like Grab, Hotstar, Airtel, Xiaomi, Telecom SL. Currently, I joined the HOOQ from like financial industry, and for me, like, how difficult it is to stream, right? So, and I was very surprised, even coming from the banking, from the trading and core banking technology that is quite complicated, and thousands of people at development coming to OTT. I thought like it could be very easy to understand, but I was quite amazed on the complexities and how many moving pieces in technology space required to run this kind of the business, and it's not cheap by long margin. So we provide the services mostly on the web, so which is a PC you can connect like a Netflix. We have a native Google Android, iOS native. We also have Android TV, Apple TV, Samsung TV, LG TV, which is a different platform altogether, as well integration for APIs with our partners like Grab and Hotstar. So this is probably you can recognize if you go to the HOOQ.tv. So this is our web base, how it looks like. So we provide a lot of content through Hollywood. We also have our original content as well. This is from your mobile native application, how it looks like. If you go more deeper, it's on the Grab integration. This is exactly, if you go to the Grab, you type on the video, you basically go into the HOOQ, and that's how we integrate it through directly API. So how the HOOQ platform is looking from like a practical perspective. So we are completely cloud native. So we don't have anything we don't own data centers. We run on AWS. We have more than 3,000 compute instances. So more than 100 databases, more than 60 load balancers. And in our case, we're using mostly ECS. We have more than 30 ECS clusters. So currently, we support them approximately more than 90 million users. So we have quite a scale. Not all the users are who is paying. It's most of the users are use or freeware or just subscribe to only for specific channels. And we have around like 60,000 hours of content, original, local, and Hollywood, that we license from the production houses. Infrastructure. So when I joined the company, we have, so I joined the company as the main scope was to try to transform the infrastructure, transform the CI/CD pipelines. And the infrastructure when I joined the company was formed from Terraform. We have some CloudFormation, a little bit of TerraGrunt. On CI/CD pipelines, so we use mainly the Jenkins. Monitoring was a mix of the CloudWatch, Elasticstack, New Relic. Elastic was maintained in our infrastructure. On container management, so we use AWS ECS part. The problem was the infrastructure itself historically was managed by the vendor, and was quite slow, and development was frustrating because they tried to release. And initially, HOOQ was designed around the classical deployment train. Development need to raise a ticket, somebody need to review it and approve. Another team was releasing it, and all this actually created frustration because sometimes we need to release very fast, and we are still a startup. So we try to adopt like big corporate development and deployment train when we are working at the startup. So it didn't match very well with the expectation and the speed that is required. So one of the points when I joined, so I need to change entire deployment model, including the underlying technology, right? So we start looking into infrastructure. So we keep infrastructure as a code, as the Terraform. We start looking into migrating from the Jenkins to GitHub Actions. One of the reasons was Jenkins, we've been supporting ourselves. We have entire clusters for the Jenkins, and the idea was not to try to eliminate as much as possible, to hire specialized people who can support this platform instead of use as much as possible as the SaaS services, which is not part of the core business and core technology stack, right? So we start focusing mostly on monitoring, enhancing on Elasticstack, and moving Elasticstack to Elastic Cloud again as a SaaS service that we can focus mostly on automation part instead of like migrating the Elastic clusters where you need to really to build deep knowledge and understand. And for this one, you just need a specialized team that we don't want to hire people. So we better to focus on somebody else can provide these services, and we focus just on the delivery for the logs, metrics, and the search engine. Classical model, so we slowly start migrating into deployment for the blue-green instead of the ad hoc. And we still keep, in the beginning, we start enhancing our offering around ECS, optimizing compute part. Second phase, what we start looking at, we started moving away from Terraform to Pulumi. One of the reasons Terraform, even it's a very good language and we've been very familiar for quite a while, but it's very limited as their cell language. It has a few limitations, especially if you try to manage big infrastructure. Like in our case, it requires a lot of workarounds. So the language itself is not very expressive. It's mostly the configuration. So Pulumi is not the language itself. It's a library that can be used in any language. It could be used in Python, TypeScript, JavaScript, Go, recently in .NET. So basically you can use your preferred language and you have complete expressivity of your programming language, and you can embed infrastructure and construct it there. And Pulumi provide these libraries, which actually are based on the Terraform plugins, like AWS plugin, GCP plugin. We start looking into the Pulumi because it allows much more flexible management of infrastructure at scale. From this CI/CD pipeline, we moved to GitHub Actions from Jenkins, but we still need to have a proper deployment strategy because we are moving from blue-green to the canary part. And in order to support the canary, where the teams, both technology and the business team, can release to only, for example, 10% of the users and get the feedback and see if this specific feature can be deployed for the rest, depending on the feedback. That's why we start looking into the Spinnaker in combination with the GitHub Actions, which is allow very flexible canary deployment model. Monitoring, we start looking slowly to migrating from New Relic to more on Kubernetes specific use cases like Prometheus Grafana, which is quite recently get very matured. And and moving for traceability, dashboarding to centralized place. Deployment, as I mentioned, we try to move from the blue-green to the canary that allow much more flexibility and the feedback on the smaller scale for the user side. Start moving away from ECS part and moving to more AWS EKS as Kubernetes services that AWS provide, and GCP, so start evaluating GPU and GCP GKE offering. And the same time was moving to the new microservice architecture, right? A few points to point out. When we talk about the DevOps and SRE, which is a main topic, right? So DevOps or SRE, they cannot live together in isolation. It's like an island, right? You cannot do the SRE model, implement the SRE model without really big changes in development. And it doesn't have a chance to stand alone. So you always need to work in the, all the pieces need to work together instead of implementing automation on the promotion code that it's going to not be properly promoted, right? So, and we started looking at other models. So, and we've been quite familiar with SRE model and or DevOps different models, and start thinking. And idea was not to copy. So, from practical perspective, you don't want to copy a model. So, you try to see first. You need to assess very carefully the size of the team. Yeah, you need to have combined skill sets, right? Experience for the team. What kind of technology they experience? What the it's very important on organizational culture, right? For example, in case of the HOOQ, as a startup, we try to pivot very, very often, right? And this was easily reflected in the code. So the code become bloated in the time and very difficult to maintain. And if you try to create an automation, so based on the cultural, organization culture and development culture, it was very difficult to automate because once you automate something like in 3 months, it will be absolute. You need to start automation from the beginning for a different product or different implementation. So we need to find like a common map that we can talk with the developers to see exactly how this automation can be formalized, and actually development team should take ownership of it. Plus tools, right? So you don't want to end up with multiple tools to manage your infrastructure or development pipeline. That you will end up with the big teams, and that knowledge will be spread. So ideally, you should have some core tools that can try to solve very, very specific problems. Code management. So the first problem we notice, we have multiple teams who develop in different languages. So most languages that we use are Node.js and Go, and some Elixir. And we find some problems in the deployment model. So each team have their own repository. And each team, for example, in Node.js team, some teams was using one version of the Node.js, another team was using different version of Node.js. Each team tried to write their own libraries. And it was very difficult to test across different repositories, right? So the main idea, the first idea was to bring all the teams together under the same repository, and basically this will force them to start collaborating, right? To bring everybody to the same versioning. Now you can do the security scan over entire repository that all your code resides, and each team now can directly test against another team's code, which is basically lives in the same repository. My idea is to move to the mono repository. So this brings entire code base in organization under the same repository. And the same time moving from different branching models. So in each team have a different way how they use the branching strategy in your code and source control system. For example, some teams are using GitHub model, another team uses using the Git. Some teams are using combination. So in order to achieve consistency in automation, you need to bring across organization one single deployment model. How do you release? How do you merge your code into your master? So we move to the classical. We just took most simplified version of the trunk-based development, which is everything resides in the masters. Our branches are very short-lived, like usually it's 1 day, and they directly move. Every time somebody create a pull request, it's reviewed, it's merged directly into the masters, and it's tested there. Before tested, it's tagged and basically promoted into the production. So from monorepo, so Monorepo is not a new concept, actually. Most of the companies already using it. So example would be Google, Facebook, Twitter, Microsoft, Uber, right? So all these company already using the mono repositories. And if you think about the Google using a single repository and Facebook as well, so they have like almost 2 terabytes size. They don't use Git. Git has a limitation in the GitHub, for example, up to 200 gigabits. But the biggest repository for the Git is a Twitter and Microsoft, right? So mono repository, it simplifies a lot of organization of your code, right? Easy to coordinate the changes across different teams and across different modules. So it's enormously simplifies when we move everybody to the single repository. The team, you could see the team start engaging and basically communicating. But before that, you always need to go to the teams. The development lead said, can you guys talk with each other and fix common problems, right? Now it's become normal. So people even didn't need to think about it. Simplify dependencies. For example, in the case of Node.js, we start using the Lerna framework. Lerna is a Facebook monorepo framework for Node.js, how it's managed the code. Yeah. We starting using the single linting, so build and test and release process. It's a consistent across all teams. Now some teams that have a dependency on each other and they can release it much more easy to coordinate in the single repository than have multiple repositories. Single place to report the issues, right? On the bug side, right? So it's very easy to see some bugs are sometimes could affect multiple teams. Right? It could be a single bug, small bug that can affect single teams, and it was very difficult to identify. And now, once you have a single repository, it was much more easier to trace of the issue that arises both from the code history perspective and how does impact the rest of your code. Testability across the modules that run together was much more easier, and the bugs we could find much earlier before moving into production. Even before moving to, for example, into the staging environment, right? So you don't need to move into the staging environment because you can capture most of the bugs directly in during the promotion into the master, for example, during the testing, unit testing. On the trunk-based development, we did some changes as well from development perspective in order to accommodate trunk-based development. We moved to the feature-based development, which each development team develop the code and add the feature, but the feature app may not be activated during the release. So you can release in the production with a feature that another teams may depend, but another teams may be not ready. So actually you're still able to release in production with the feature, but your Activision flag could be disabled, right? So, and this allows us much more flexible promotion of the code in production, even with the feature turned on, and you can anytime turn it off, feature turn it off, and anytime you can turn it off for testability to see directly in production when your another team are ready to ingest the feature or to consume it. Integrating the code continuously, it's much more flexible. Every time with the team was erasing the branch and merging into the master, you can immediately try to test it. And promotion could be, you can release a few times a day. We move from like release cycles once a week to the basically once a day release. Continuous code review. This is in combination with the monorepo, allow much more easy and flexible code review processes. Release an application, change consecutively. So it was, so as I mentioned, it's a few teams could develop a similar feature and they need to be released together. Once you have in the trunk-based development with the monorepo, allow you a much more flexible way to release feature simultaneously. Gradually introduce new feature as a feature-based development, which has helped us achieve this flexibility. So we move more to the model of the continuous delivery model from like a classical train-based model. On the trunk-based development, we work very closely with Jira. For example, different teams could use a different board. Some teams using Kanban, another teams using the Scrum. It was up to the team what is more flexible for them. But the idea was every single story in the Jira is a branch So, and the naming convention for the branch and story should be the same. Your branch lifecycle management usually was for 1 day. You merge in the same day into the master. You create a pull request, somebody review it. Once unit test is passed, once it's merged into the master, automatically deploy into the staging environment. Then you run the bunch of the test. So we have a separate testing framework. What you do, you do functional testing, integration testing. Once this is done, you get the development team usually get a report, test pass. They just go to the commit and tag it for production, and this go immediately into production. And they could release multiple times a day. And we try to encourage on the focus to release as small as possible the code changes, instead of like big bang, work for a few weeks and the big code change, because it's very difficult to debug. So if you release and the release was broken in production, you know exactly which line of code is broke, and was very easy to revert back. So we focus a lot on to revert back instead of trying to make it 100% stable, because allow us much more faster move and on release management cycle. This is our Kanban board. We try on Kanban board that we used for cloud infrastructure as a team. When we start building the new infrastructure premise, we start with a few principles. Yeah. So nothing is manual. So everything should be reflecting in the code. Both the infrastructure as a code and the code deployment itself, it should be completely automated. Even most of the operation team and development team didn't have access, right access to the production and staging environment. Any change or any bug that need to be refixed, it should be fixed in code and promoted. Additionally, the cloud engineering team, cloud SRE team, developed completely promotional model based on the Terraform and the modules. They've been able to get the ownership of entire infrastructure as a code to development. Now the development team have complete ownership, and they own not only their code that in the production, but also underlying infrastructure. And this is how we basically design our infrastructure. We create for every single microservice, we create a separate network stack that development team have complete ownership of the network stack, and they can release. For example, if they want to release, they need to have access, for example, to open new security port. It will be up to development to do it, because they have a full control. They just create the new security groups, open the port, and in this case, they're completely segregated and doesn't affect any other teams. So the release model was very focused on the development and on microservice itself as a single components that can be released independently. We started with this principle: everything is a code, right? So nothing is manual. We start moving. Previously, we have a lot of manual testing. So we encourage development and work very closely with the different teams and created our own test automation framework that was using both TDD and BDD on the developer side, plus using our own framework, so we can capture most of the bugs before release. Another principle: development team should support their own environment. All services should be completely decoupled, both from infrastructure release cycle and code cycle. Production release, it's only through promotion of the code. So nobody could promote any container, for example, that was built in development without the testing. So, and this was built inside the CI/CD pipeline, so as a framework. So you cannot promote your code ad hoc. It was completely before any promotion, everything should be tested automatically. So it doesn't allow you even to promote the code without the testability. Challenges. We had a lot of challenges when we started. I mean, how would you promote infrastructure as a code, right? So one of the problem from infrastructure perspective, your development environment and staging environment and production environment should be stable. So from development perspective, development environment may not be stable, but from infrastructure perspective, development is like any other environment, it should be stable, right? So we create separate accounts where we can test our infrastructure before promoting. to the development. Additionally, what we work on very closely with the development to have all environments to be very similar. For example, production and staging was almost like copycats, except in the staging you have a less capacity. You don't have a so big databases. And when you promote, when we talk about infrastructure as a code, again, it's the same, you promote the code itself. So because your environments are very similar, your code base is the same. And we use Terraform workspaces, for example, for this use case, which allows us this flexibility to use the same code, not to copy paste the code between environments. The same point, how would you promote application code between environments? Example, previously we had inconsistency. Some teams, for example, been building the container, they've been testing the container, and when the container passed the test, they build another container in another environment in order to promote it. So idea was you test one container, but actually you promote a different container. So you cannot create, it's great inconsistency between the promotions. So we try to break this model. So the container that was tested, this exactly container will be promoted. Or basically more, it's a Docker image. So the Docker image that was tested as a container is the same image as the promoted. So to keep consistency between environment, as I said, so we use the Terraform workspaces, that we use the same code base. It's just environment variables, or how big your instance is, how many instances. This is the difference between the environments. We built a metric-driven culture. So before was like a lot of guessing, right? So we didn't have a lot of exposure and a lot of informations on how to, for example, do the capacity planning. An example would be if you're running ECS, how many EC2 instances, minimum, maximum, how can you scale? So you always need to have this information ahead instead of guessing. So we start using metric bits and with Elastic to get completely overview of the capacity of the system. And depending on the load, we know exactly how to scale, how to release, and what to expect. What to monitor, right? So you have millions of metrics in both in your application side and which AWS provides. And it's very important to know what metrics it's really important and what metric you should be alerted on, because you cannot be alerted for non-metrics, and how alerts should be triggered. Best deployment strategy. So we start moving away from blue-green deployment to more to canary deployment that allow us this kind of the testability with directly consumers, and to get the feedback and to see if the assumptions are correct, to validate our assumption. If assumption is correct in the code, then we can promote for the rest of the users, the changes. How to test resilience in production. Same, we start exploring the chaos engineering that was pioneered by Netflix to randomly destroy EC2 instances, or even removing the Redis clusters in production. We had a mixed success. Probably we are not so our initial design resiliency. When we start testing, we discover a few gaps that we actually start covering, mostly in our architectural limitation, but it was a very good lessons, and we try to continue testing and destroying instances in production. Another very big challenge was how do you build a culture of innovation and fast experimentation, growth mindset in organization? Even in the startup, this is still a challenge. I can only imagine on the big organization how difficult is it, but even the startup to create we had like 60 plus engineers, and just to make 60 engineers to communicate with each other, it was a challenge. And when you have hundreds of thousands of engineers, even more difficult. So at some point, so we solved most of the problems. Still, some problems need to be solved, and it really was quite a wild ride. So we look for SRE and infrastructure as a code and all this technology. It's more from the practical lenses. We don't take any framework for granted. We tried a lot of frameworks and see which one doesn't work. Which one works we keep, which one doesn't work we try to throw away. So all this is very much depending on your organization. So I don't think it's any organization can blindly accept any framework in the DevOps, could be SRE or any other framework. It should be very much evaluated in the context of existing resources, existing capabilities, and existing cultural, and how this can be mapped. And probably the Jamie and Sriram said it's a journey, right? So like implementation of the Agile, and it's continuous journey, right? And probably this is how it should be treated from the beginning. So that's it on our experiences. So probably we can have more questions after that.
Okay, thank you so much, Yen. For those who have questions for Yen, do drop your questions in the chat. Okay, let's move to our last speaker for the day. Let's invite Krist. Krist, over to you.
Hi, Aaron. Can you see my screen?
I'm starting to share the screen. Yeah,
Yeah.
we can see your screen now.
Okay, 1 second. Okay. Hi, everyone. Thanks very much for the opportunity to present today's session. My name is Chris Yong. I'm from Enable Professional Services. I'm here to share on the topic of building a digital operating model for high velocity IT. A bit of background who I am. I look after Enable Professional Services here in ASEAN. Enable Professional Services, we do nothing but ServiceNow implementation. So the focus of today's topic is very much on how ServiceNow could be a potential operating model, and how ServiceNow potentially can be used to balance out between the agility but still meeting the requirements of the traditional IT. I'm here to share that. But my passion and my interest is very much on the Prince2, the Agile, the ITIL of the world. So I've done quite a number of projects across the board. While here at Enable, using ServiceNow, we've been doing quite a number of projects across government, financial sectors as well. Part of today's session is I'd like to share how potentially ServiceNow is being utilized in those environments. Right. So a bit of background who Enable is. So as I mentioned, Enable Professional Services is inch wide, miles deep, just focusing on ServiceNow, which is to a certain extent is a good thing. But the way I approach a lot of customers is understanding there's very often different cultural experience, different tool sets that's being used, different processes. What's important is bringing what's real. So Enable has operations across Singapore, Hong Kong, Thailand, originally based off from Australia. And we have a big center of excellence over at in India. The team that we have are very much very focused technical team, all very passionate from a tool sets perspective. And hence that's why we have done a lot of work that sort of see how we can address business problems using the platform. And hence that's why we have quite a few applications that built on top of the platform, like the COVID-19 applications that in terms of how you can quickly react at Scoot, for example, and so on and so forth. So this is just so ServiceNow DevOps, ServiceNow DevOps module, it's still in the GA, generally available. So this presentation may include some forward-looking statement, visuals, and sort of features. Hence, some of those features, right, is to be decided. So I just need to flesh this out as part of a safe harbor notice. Okay, so this is the business imperative for scaling DevOps to the enterprise, right? So transformation is driving DevOps, but very often organizations struggle to scale DevOps or see the value, right? Small teams are making progress, but the overall delivery life cycles are not speeding up, and reliability problems remain, right? So there's often a mismatch in the needs of the enterprise and the operating model of individual teams, right? So where ServiceNow as a platform attempts to solve this problem to see how you want to automate the enterprise perspective. Yeah. So DevOps exposes the challenges that, as Yong has shared, Jamie has shared, where individual teams very often try to comply with that broader enterprise requirement, right? And very often, as we know today, there's DevOps sort of led exponential growth in the rate of change, right? So that's not making things better. And large organization must still retain the assurance delivered by a change management process, right? But the traditional manual sort of train approach can impact development team productivity, right? And very often developers get frustrated and they are less productive, right? So the typical 2 to 3 weeks process that doesn't work, yeah, in a new world. So after interacting with, we know today, if you've seen it earlier as well, so there's actually a very consistent theme in what the overall, from a DevOps perspective, right? The need for speed and governance is critical to the adoption of DevOps for enterprise customers, right? So at one point, there's a need for speed. At another point, you need the governance, right? This is especially true for many heavily regulated industries like financial, right? But most companies are developing content under some kind of regulations such as privacy, information security, health payments, etc. Right? With that's still in progress. However, technology does not slow down DevOps, right? So we are still building pipelines to release codes into productions in seconds. However, if you're not following some aspect of the change management process from a governance perspective, very often we run into risks of causing outages. And a Gartner report estimate unplanned outages, right, costs up to $5,000 per minute, or 300,000 per hour, right? So keeping companies from introducing risks into the production environment while still harnessing, right, the speed and agility that we know of DevOps, right? Bringing in an organization in the fine balance that every company faces today, right? So very often the common theme is the customer overall wants to manage the risk while going fast, right? And not making developers furious. And that's a challenge that we all know, and that's what ServiceNow has been very much focusing from a product perspective. So what ServiceNow attempt to do is to bridge that sort of the speed and agility of DevOps and the safety of those assurance and the regulations. Yeah. So as we know today, DevOps landscape has many tools, right? Each DevOps teams tends to select their own tools, which leads to organizations to have different tools to accomplish the same task. Very often, teams also needs to build all the plumbing, right, to connect these tool sets, right? One of the problems that we hear very, very, very often is like there are many, many, many tools out there in the DevOps space, making it difficult to plan, manage, track, work, deliverables, right? So this leads to lack of productivity, swivel chair, lack of agility, confusions, yeah, and of course cost, right? And the construction and maintenance of this plumbing is commonly called what we commonly call DevOps techs, which consume 10% of typically engineering efforts. So you could say that computes to 20K of dev per year. So that's like the DevOps techs. We have also seen this before. So this is the periodic table of the DevOps tools, right? So where ServiceNow is coming from, it's again from a collaboration perspective, how you can front end it and gel all these two sets together. But I'll talk more about it next. So weaving it together in the world of DevOps, DevOps and DevOps tools. So each yeah, so the construction, so in terms of weaving it together, if you see at the bottom from a horizontal perspective, so apart from ServiceNow, there's also other tool sets, right? Like the Jira, your other tool sets. Now, ServiceNow attempts to sort of weave all this together, right? And there's an approach that is recommended from a ServiceNow perspective, and very often from an Enable perspective, we are being pulled into this conversation. How do we do this, right? So tool chains, as we know, are complex and they're varied, but it's expensive in terms of development downtime to force everyone into a single tool chain. Very often that doesn't work. And the answer and the approach that we put together and very often have to be adjusted over time is to use what you already have, right? And then adjust it and look at how we can do continuous improvement, right, over time. So the approach very often we recommend is to look at how you can connect your key DevOps tools that you currently have today, right? And ServiceNow sort of have those out-of-box integration ranging from planning tools like Jira, or within ServiceNow, there's also equivalent Jira using the ITBM module to the code repositories like GitHub or Bitbucket for your pipeline tools like Jenkins. And using those informations, right, from those two chains to automate those creation of a change requests, right, within ServiceNow. So initiating the assurance path without requiring developers to swivel chair, right, to another tool, right, to create a change request, because that's the assurance that you need to create from a governance perspective. So they don't have to enter anything in ServiceNow. So everything will be piped into ServiceNow, so we'll still meet that requirement. Right, so this alone actually has an implication to major savings in developers' productivity. Right, so developers will still prefer to use the Jenkins of the world, the GitHub of the world, right? From a code perspective. Now, from here, we can also use change management policies to automate the change approval process. Right, a risk and fact-based assessment can ensure the safe, automated approval of a large proportion of the change, right? So the data gather allows for new insights across multiple teams and DevOps tool chains. And a key use of this data is for auditing, which is which becomes a one-button action, linking all the way from ideation to production instead of manual integration and data gathering, right, process that can take multiple weeks of effort, right, from an end-to-end perspective, right? So again, this is just ServiceNow is just one of the tool set. Of course, there's other tool sets that does this, but ultimately the goal is to collaborate and weaving all of this together. So the ServiceNow product sort of fills a gap in the industry that exists around automating the change management process, right? Making it easy as running a report to gathering audit materials. And very often within the ServiceNow sort of product, what it does, it also assists in having different CAP approvals, right? So some might require a different sort of risk assessment from a network perspective compared to your DevOps to your traditional IT, right? So the different risk assessment and policies can be set accordingly within the same platform, rather than using multitudes of platforms, et cetera, et cetera. So this allows the ops teams to sort of set rules, right, that they want to, and will allow them to change to create via API, data to be gathered to access the risk of this change. Then all this validation passes, and then they automate the change request as required. Now, on the other context, right, if the traditional IT can still follow through that 2 weeks lead time for network opening or a train deployment and so on and so forth. So since all the storing of those data of the platform from ideation of a new feature or even an unplanned outage needs to be fixed, so reports can be shown to the auditors to complete the chain of custody for audit requirements to be fulfilled, right? We're all within ServiceNow. So I want to share, it's like how in this heavily regulated organizations using ServiceNow in terms of weaving it together from a DevOps perspective. So, so it's a large financial services company. What it does is auto-populates the change requests, right, to ensure that code-ready checks have been completed and closes a change leveraging on Jenkins and then end times, right? So by doing so, it saves a lot of time. You know, on it's 2.5 hours instead of 23 days for an average change duration. 99% of time savings in gathering and submitting the audit data, because you can just pull off the report all within the single platform. Yeah. So a little bit of details here. So part of that change creations through your Jenkins, right? It will auto-populate all your priorities, your risk impact, short description through an API. So you pull this data into a change request. Now, what ServiceNow post-submission, what ServiceNow does is you check whether the code ready checks, you know, based on the CI, based on some testing, a black duck SSAP requirements, and then that will set all the way to a change closure. So this will meet the audit requirements, compliance requirements. Yeah. So by doing so, value outcome achieved from the large organization is by automating those audit data collection. These are some of the cost savings, and the cost savings actually mix of actual and expected result there. And then 20 hours per month, say from dev team from manual swiveling, right, and frustration, because while you're ready to do code deploy, you still have to raise a change request, right? And approve the 3 times the changes approved, you know, in the first 9 months since they have this integrated. Yeah, from this perspective. However, I'd like to highlight as well, very often, all of this is only achievable with combination of culture and combination of an enterprise architect to sort of look at how the people and process can be weaved together. Okay, so yeah, so just to highlight what are some of the DevOps values that can be achieved. So how does it look like within ServiceNow? So provided you have multitudes of, so as I mentioned earlier, from a ServiceNow perspective, you can pipe all these tools into ServiceNow. So effectively you can have visualization of a pipeline. So with a single view of your multiple pipelines from a specific DevOps product or multiple products, right? Pipe it into ServiceNow, okay? So you have that visualization. From visualizations, you can run the testing and sort of, and you can reflect within your pipeline. And then the detailed sort of accurate information automatically captured within a change record for audit. So that's how you can automate it. Now you can see from here the entire workflow is tracked, right? And you can tie this all back to exactly what the story is, what the commit is. You can tie that back into the job run, which is tied to the change, and which is and can be tied to an incident. Let's say once we push it, there's an incident happening, we can tie that back into an incident. So you have a sort of end-to-end flow, right? From deployment to actually operations. So there's the features that so part of the capability within the platform, you can provide the respective reporting and analytics so that they will provide business insights. So whatever we're deploying across products and testing and deployment, all this can be churned out from KPI reporting, from commit insights, test insights, etc., etc. Yeah, all within the single platform. So the as you know, as I mentioned earlier, so ServiceNow DevOps is still in GA. So the ServiceNow has been very consistently for the past 9 years, been doing 2 major releases a year. So part of the next release, which is Paris, right? They will have this one in to deploy, where they would have all of this sort of weave together, so that will actually provide better collaboration tool sets across the DevOps tools chain. So Wayfair was one of another online retailer that have used ServiceNow as a means to weave your multiple tool sets. So they sort of improved some code releases from 10 weeks to over 2,500 code releases in a week, right? But still meeting the audit requirements. So that's quite a major sort of improvement. So revert times were improved, quite a number of times. They've also reduced the integration times. So Swiss RE, it's another use case here. So manual integration was initially developed and maintained before ServiceNow was done. So through this integration, they achieved some of this value. So by driving automated change using change policies. Yeah. Okay, so as you know, ServiceNow, it's a platform, right? So there's many applications in there. So how to weave all the DevOps practice together? Very often you look at how you can drive your digital evolution by using some of these functions and tool sets. Now, the way
Is the coffee? Or you're done?
Sorry. Hello. Yeah, let me continue. So, so multiple tool sets. So, so across that various tool sets, ServiceNow puts it all together in a single data model, in a single code base. That's how they can achieve that automation. All right, Aaron, that's it for now. So I'll save the Q&A for the later session. I'll hand it back to you.
Hey, thanks, Chris. Okay, so I think now it's time for the audience. If you have any questions, to put it into the chat group, and then we'll just give a couple of minutes for the audience to think through it, type in your question, and then we'll ask the speaker to see if they're able to help clarify any of your questions. Okay, we have our first question from Sandeep. So the question is, how closely are the SRE and production support role related? So if any of the speaker would like to take this question, please you can unmute yourself and then you can.
Aaron, let me take this. Shri here. Hi, Sandeep. Thank you for your question. I think, one of the things that's common coming out of all the sessions that we see, especially the session that Jamie gave, and also some elements of what Ian mentioned, SRE eventually is one of the primary roles is to remove toil or automate everything. How will they automate everything if they don't understand the impact of the automation? And that's the reason why, if you remember the session that I covered, the best SREs typically are people who have got very strong operational knowledge, but then become full stack engineers. Because then you have, because you're just not a technologist, you also understand functionality. And being in the industry for so many years, I see that there is a significant amount of value that that I see from resources who have been in the support side, because they see a much different and a wider horizon than what developers see. Developers will might see only a module or a platform, whereas support typically looks at the end-to-end service. So that's the reason why I think it is much, if somebody has done a few years of support, has had a development background, and he wants to be SRE, he or she is probably best suited to take that journey. And that's why, and to be fair, SRE also interacts with support quite closely, because every time there's an incident in production, either SRE themselves will recover the incident by automating tools, or they will create automation for a very small, thin support frontline, which will then use the tools built by SRE to recover the incidents, right? So one, SRE is very closely coupled with support, as is to the left-hand side of the SDLC cycle, which is development, testing, all those sides, but also SRE is very close to production. So that's the reason why support and SRE are very close, and people who are in support, they're probably best positioned. If your organization is moving towards SRE, you're probably best positioned to become SREs, provided you invest in yourself to understand technology and become a full stack engineer. Did I answer that question, Sandeep?
Yeah. Yes, Sriram. Yeah, I have much understanding now between difference between SRE and support. Yeah, thank you.
If I just kind of short comment to what Sriram mentioned it. So I have a quite extensive experience in support, because I did many years application support in the banking, in the trading. And it's, to answer to your question more specifically, it depends. Very much depends on organization, culture, and just to give you an example, right? So when I was leading the team of the support engineers in derivatives trading, right? So most of the work that been done was so much technical. It was very, very business oriented. Yeah. An example would be if you have like a bond trade, right? They need to understand complete how the bond is priced, where to look. So these kind of the capabilities is not SRE specific. SRE is very technology focused, right? Now, if you talk about the production support for narrow application, for example, without much of the business knowledge, purely technical, yes, they could be very easy incorporated. If it's a business oriented or business logic support as well to the technology part, then probably not. So probably it's very much depend on your classical model organization, how it's structured around what is kind of capabilities production support required to know. So this probably will be the answer. It depends.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Ian. Thanks, Sriram. Okay, let's see if there's another question. I do have one that I will share. on the chat, which is how would you define what a successful SRE will look like?
I have a short one. Yeah.
Sorry, go on.
Yeah, I have a short one. Successful SRE, for how I see it personally, it's something that always evolves, right? So it's never static. It always becomes something else. So that's how I will define successful SRE. It's not specific to outcome, it's specific to evolution.
Yeah, I would probably second that, what Ian mentioned. But also it depends upon how this question has been framed. Is it a question of a SRE as an individual or SRE as a function? And that's not clear. If it's from an individual perspective or from a function perspective, both of those rules apply. But from a function perspective or an organization perspective, it could be a much wider response actually. So I'm not clear whether it is and what does a successful SRE look like is, I probably think it relates to an individual or a person who's doing the SRE role. Then that answer would be absolutely spot on.
Yeah, Aaron, I would just like to add as well. I think it's like successful DevOps. I mean, if you ask an organization, are you practicing DevOps? And they say, yes, we hired Sri, then you don't have successful DevOps. And I think it would be the same for SRE, because an SRE is supposed to drive a culture of engineering practices and to make sure that everyone thinks about, scalability and reliability of services. So if we're still, looking at individuals and saying, here is our SRE or here is our DevOps engineer, then we're not quite there yet in terms of having it as a successful culture.
I completely agree with you, Jamie, because I remember, I think in a couple of years back, we had a very long conversation when we started the SRE journey with Bloomberg. And this was with the head of SRE for feeds. It was almost a 90-minute conversation. And what we learned from that conversation was more than what we could actually fathom. They had been in this journey for 3 years, and they still believed that they're still evolving. And that basically tells it all, right? It is going to be a journey, and there'll be a maturity. Probably what's missing in the industry now is, like you have for development, SEI CMM level 1 to level 5. I think there's no maturity model, but can that maturity model be carved out based on frameworks? Probably can. Probably it will come at some point in time, but that maturity is what will change. But I think the evolution will be continued.
Okay, we have another question, which is how do level 2 and level 3 support engineers get involved in the SRE framework or teams, or would they remain as service operation staff?
I can take that. Okay, so again, this is experience. We are moving from a traditional L1, L2, L3 model completely, right? And we're moving towards a very clear, fully engineering mindset-driven organization, where most of the repeated task is either self-service or there's some virtual assistant that is there, and the virtual assistant will respond to most of the queries. So what's left is basically a React function, which is first responders to incidents, and the rest is basically SREs, right? So the L1, L2, L3 model is completely transforming into virtual assistants, first responder, small group, and the rest is SRE. So from a very, very large organization, we're going to become a very, very nimble organization. And I think that's where the industry is heading towards. And that was covered in bullets in Jamie's slide as well, where we talk about virtual assistants and chatbot and self-service portals, whereas the rest of the organization is busy killing Toil, right? And they're basically also building blueprint for how strategic platforms should be there and trying to bake in resiliency in the future platforms.
Yeah, I agree. And look, going back to my presentation, it was really one of the points that I made was SRE and DevOps and Agile. It's really for a different business goal. That's why I said it needs CEO to be on board. The business strategies have changed from the past, where we look at our internal cost centers like marketing and HR and IT, and we just look at them purely as cost centers and say they have to be as cheap as possible. And when that is the business objective, then the CIO and the head of marketing and the head of HR will introduce standard processes and utilization because of that business objective. It's all about lowering the cost of our processes. Because of digital transformation, because of the boom in the startup industry, and because your local company has competitors now in all around the world, we can't use low cost as a competitive advantage anymore. The competitive advantage is delivering value quickly to your customers and consistently. And the low cost models like escalation just don't support it. So it has to change if the business wants to be competitive.
Okay, thank you. There's one more question. I think Yen probably want to bring this up for the panel to discuss as well, which is, how do you see the evolution of SRE in the future?
I've just got a personal opinion on this one where I have a hope. And I've been in this sort of consulting and training practice for a long time now, and I've seen something happen to ITIL and IT service management, and I saw a similar thing happen to DevOps, and I'm hoping that it doesn't happen to SRE, and that is losing focus on the people side. For service management, the emphasis was supposed to be on how everyone works together for the software lifecycle. But what happened is people just focused on processes. For DevOps, it's supposed to be a culture that breaks down barriers between dev and operations and get everyone working together, again, to improve the service or software lifecycle. But a lot of companies have just focused on tools. And that's what I hope we don't see for SRE, is like a similar pattern where we lose the deeper meaning behind it. It is not just about the tools. As important as the tools are, it is not just about the tools. So I hope that in the SRE world, and also in the DevOps world as well, there's a bit of a resurgence in the culture of DevOps and the culture of all the people of DevOps.
I want to second Jamie on that. Actually, as SRE, I mean, the fact that SRE predates DevOps from a starting point, and the fact that it's been 17 years and we're still talking about the existence or the future of SRE is reminiscent of the fact that the path is right, but it's just the implementation that goes wrong, and then it basically, the influencers change confidence on that movement, right? SRE is a full mindset cultural shift. It needs a very different mindset. It needs a top-down sponsorship. And also, one of the things that Jamie mentioned, which is true for all, in our space where we're building new strategic platforms, SRE has to be in the culture from the start of the new platforms getting built. It is not a post-facto thought process, oh, now we need an SRE team. It has to be part of the squads and the tribes that build new platforms. And that's how it is a full culture shift, and the culture shift will make, technologists think like engineers and not like, rudimentary support staff or, looking at run books, right? It's about questioning, why am I doing this? Is there a better way to do it? Can I make it better? Right? And it's also challenging status quo. And I think, and that in any organization, small and big, is a very different challenge. For a large organization, even more complex. But smaller organization, that's why they embrace things that will continue to be the way, because the TCO, or the cost of ownership of platforms, will have to come down simply because of the pressure fintechs are generating on the bigger and the other industries. And the model, which I think in one of the slides we saw, where even if your user base is exponentially increasing, you don't need exponential growth of your support staff, right? And if you had the right engineers, they basically will compensate for the manual inefficiency. So I think it is going to continue, and just like how manufacturing moved from a very manual, bespoke, car manufacturing, right? So everything was handmade. It's become significantly industrialized and robotized. I think technology will go, and I think humans will become more the people who are thinking of the next big thing, or thinking about how to make it better. So I think SRE is here to stay. But to Jamie's point, it depends on how the organization and how the industry keeps pushing the cultural shift, rather than we trying to sell tools to support it or processes to support it.
Yeah, I mean, if we focus on just the technology side, we really limit the number of people that we can discuss with, because as we get into containers and release architectures and tools, a lot of people within IT are just not going to be interested. And if we have those topics, it will just seem as though SRE is it's a very technical subject. So I think the SREs, actual SREs, the engineers themselves, really have to think about how they're going to communicate their practice in order for it to be adopted as a whole IT practice, rather than just a technical practice.
Yeah, maybe I will add that because it was my question, and I tried to maybe add some comments around it, right? So, as you probably both pointed out, it's not a technology problem, right? Technology evolves, and always adding new tools will try to solve specific problem and solve well. So when we're talking about the evolution of the SRE or automation, probably I'll start to see evolution. How did we end up with SRE in the first place, right? If you look about in the 90s, 95 with Scrum, and what Agile tried to solve the problem, right? It's tried to solve the gap in communication between the business and development and the solution, right? As a product. So technology become more and more important, right? That's why you have a lean, Agile, all these frameworks come in to try to solve exactly this problem with the specific methodologies, right? In 2003 and then 2016, or 2006 or 9, when the DevOps started, right? Most of the business understand, okay, so we solved the problem, how to communicate with the development, but we still left away the DevOps, for example, or the operations part, right? And let's bring them together, for example. That's more in the movement in SRE to try to, okay, so now you have a comprehensive view across from the business requirements, developing the product, and now in the productionalize it, right? So try to probably build the entire chain, right? And this is my point when I asked the question, how would you see this evolution? What's next? What kind of next big problem to solve? Even if we are in the beginning, even in Agile and DevOps cultural changes. So just a quick comment from my side.
Okay, thank you all the speakers. Any more questions from the audience? We still have time for a couple of questions.
Can I just ask, is Krist, are you still online? I can't see the attendee list. Okay, Krist, just got a question for you, just in relation to this, because Krist has been in the IT service management space for a long time, and ServiceNow as a platform was originally an ITIL-based platform. So that's a platform that has the ITIL standard processes, which support the standard IT goal of being low cost. So I just wanted to ask Krist, in terms of like the evolution, are you seeing the companies that you're working with, are they slowly shifting away from these low cost approaches?
Yeah, so definitely. What often we have seen in some of the customers, they will have an existing or a separate DevOps team that sort of sits side by side, right, with the whole traditional IT, right? But from a platform and sort of practice perspective, there's always the gap, right? So the usual conversation that I get into is like, how do you bridge the two, right? But still sort of fulfilling the audit requirements, compliance, right? So what often we come into is you have two different sort of sets or three different sets of change policies but you still meet the requirements, so you still can maintain agility. So it's an evolution that I see very often that's happening in telcos, in the bank, manufacturing, but you still use a single set of tool sets because you can effectively still report, you can still follow that process. But for the DevOps team, which they sort of for specific product, they sort of evolve within there. They can still interact with them, but not making the developers mad. So I see a lot of that right now.
Great, thank you.
Okay, we have another question, which is, does SRE approach of Google equal to service transition of ITIL? It seems to be an overlap. This from Ming Liu.
Hang on, I can answer that one. So I've taught ITIL, and Krist has too, for a decade or more. So service transition in ITIL doesn't exist anymore. It was in version 3, which we're now in version 4. So in version 3, ITIL had a linear service lifecycle that was strategy, design, transition, operations, and everything would flow, through that kind of linear pattern. However, in version 4, which only came out in 2019, so if you're not aware, then that's why. In version 4, they have taken away any linear lifecycle, and they've moved to what you'll hear a lot of, especially in the DevOps and SRE side, in DevOps and SRE world, is it's about value streams. So in ITIL, it's all about value streams, and those value streams are unique to a particular service. And what they're looking at in ITIL is they're saying that, sometimes your services are truly boring, systems of record, and those systems of record are not giving you a competitive advantage, and they should be optimized for low cost. But you have other products and services which are your competitive advantage. This is what you're trying to be known for in the industry. And those services should be optimized for high velocity. So ITIL 4 is saying that IT needs a multi-speed IT model that is high velocity where it makes sense and is low cost where it makes sense. And so, yes, it's not exactly the same as the old version 3 strategy, design, transition, operations lifecycle.
Yeah, good question.
Okay, thanks, Jamie. Any more questions? We can probably take one more questions before we move to the end of the session.
Maybe if I can ask audience, right, who joined, how do you feel this format on the webinar? Is it engaging? So I'm just curious to get a feedback.
I would say that's, if it was face to face, we would have meet in person then, but since it's all online, given the situation, COVID situation, it's the best suited for this point in time. But it's still helping. Yeah.
Thanks, Sandeep. Anyone else want to share their thoughts?
I'm sure we'll have holograms in the future. We'll interact with everyone.
We probably need 6G or 7G in order to support that. Okay, if not, I would like to thank our speaker, Jamie, Sriram, Yen, and Krist for taking time off to help share their experience with regard to DevOps and also SRE. And also, of course, for our participants who join us for today's webinar. Before we go, I have actually shared the QR code again. Do scan the QR code and give us your feedback to see how we can make the next session even more interactive and better for everyone, as we are all in the learning cycle as well. And for those who are interested in any of the DevOps or SRE courses that NUS ISS is offering, you can always go to our website as well. I've included the search tag that you can look for, which is SRE and DevOps. And we are still operating during this time. In fact, we are moving to e-learning during this period, and we don't know when the entire circuit breaker will be removed, because I foresee that even come June, probably it will be more of a phase kind of release, I will call it. But definitely, SS is still continue to offering all this e-learning for everyone during this time for us to upgrade ourselves. Okay, so once again, thank you very much. Thank you, Jamie, Sriram, Yen, and Krist for your time. And thank you all the participants for coming in. I hope to see you all again in our next webinar.
Thank
Okay,
you.
we'll keep the Zoom screen on for the next couple of minutes so that the folks can do the scanning and also submit their feedback. Thanks, everyone. Have a nice day. Okay, bye.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.